Today's scripture lesson today comes from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But by that time, the boat, battered by waves, was far from land, and the wind was against them. Early in the morning he came walking towards them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "Is it a ghost?" They cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink and cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This scripture lesson to me is always ones that we kind of whoosh by. It's kind of falls into fairy tale land, that we don't see people walking on water or the sea or neither above. And it's one that you really don't use as an evangelical scripture for calling people to come to Christ who've never seen them. In fact, it's one of those scriptures that modern Christians, liberal Christians, are often trying to make excuses around. Well, it really wasn't walking on the water. It falls into the biblical category of these stories. Moses splitting the Red Sea. In the book of Judges, the Israelites go out in battle, and the battle lasts so long that God stops the sun, so they can battle on through the rest of the day before the sun would move, so they could wipe out their enemies. So the sun stops in the sky. There's the burning bush, too. You got that one. And then there's, the virgin birth, and some would say the resurrection too. They all are stories that go beyond the pale of what's normal in life. And in fact, have been people throughout time who've wanted to cut these out. Thomas Jefferson famously cut all these stories out of his Bible. He had no room for these miracles that were beyond the pale, that wouldn't be explained in a normal manner. Miracle stories have always been hard as far as the Bible is concerned. And in fact, the farther we get into this 21st century, they seem even more remote when we think about them. Some people just suspend reality and go, "Isn't that quaint that Jesus walked on water, that he was able to do such things?" Well, let me tell you a little bit about the story and about the person who wrote it. Mr. Matthew, whom we think wrote this Bible, at least whoever wrote it, we gave him the name Matthew, wrote this book at a time when the church was under incredible oppression. The church had fallen away from being under the guise of Judaism, was standing on its own, and as far as the Roman Empire was concerned, it lost its protection when that happened. The Roman Empire was perfectly fine with antique religions like Judaism, which they seemed as quaint and backward, but that there was a group of people who worshiped that way, and therefore that was okay. Christianity, on the other hand, was making inroads in the places where the Romans really didn't care about. People who were in the Roman Empire were being drawn to Christianity because it was a new way of thinking about the world around them. No longer were the gods there capriciously making the world change for them and having to offer offerings to them in the temples throughout the cities. But there was one God, and there was one reconciler, and his name was Jesus. And so when we come to the story, we have to remember the background in which Matthew writes this book. A couple things are happening here that people don't really realize. This is the first place in the Gospel of Matthew that records Jesus praying to God. And there's only one other place that Jesus prays to God in the whole Gospel of Matthew, and that is in the Garden of Gethsemane before his arrest. So only two places in the Gospel of Matthew does Jesus pray. The second thing that happens is that Jesus is not just singularly walking on water, he's walking on the sea. And that's an important thing to notice about this passage, because the sea represented much more than water represents. The sea represents the cosmic chaos of the world. And in fact, the importance of biblical passages in the sea is they are solely the domain of God. Whether it's splitting the Red Sea for the children of Israel to go across to escape the Egyptians, or it's even Jonah being thrown off the boat into the sea. Once someone was in the sea, they were totally within the realm of God. And so it's important that Matthew chooses the word sea. Jesus walks on the Sea of Galilee as a way of expressing being in the realm of God. And in a certain sense, being within God and surrounded by God's power. That power is made evident by Jesus walking on it. And for the most part, the people who were listening to this were not concerned about the gravity, about Jesus' defying gravity by staying on top of water. What they were concerned about was, how does one fall in and be one with the power of God? How is it that one can incorporate and be involved and encompassed by God's love so completely that God's power surrounds them even to defy the sea? You have to remember during this time that when people traveled on the sea, they traveled by coast. They didn't generally zoom out into the ocean where you no longer saw land. It was really late in antiquity where sea routes became so commonplace that people could follow and go off and not see land at all for a number of days to get from one place to another. And in fact, if you look at the journey of Paul, they did specific sightings from one place to another. They'd take a star, they'd look at it, and they would follow that star to make sure that they would hit the island of Cyprus or to go to Spain or some other else. So there was some sighting going on there, but people were concerned about that. And in fact, even in Paul's travels, you have this part where there's this great storm at sea, and it's only changed by Paul taking command of the boat captain and saying that it's really important that you let me off here for the storm to stop raging. So Paul, in his journeys, is one with God and therefore one with God's power in the sea. The second player of this story is important to see too. We think of Peter as just kind of this bumbler, in the Gospels, because he's asked the questions that no one wants to ask. He becomes the voice of the person who would be the one who stands to the side and is thinking it, but he vocalizes it, and therefore he becomes chided a lot of times, or he becomes kind of the fool. If you think about the Transfiguration story, for example, where Peter comes up to Jesus and says, "Oh, it's great, we're here, let us do these things." Or he's the one who recognizes the Christ, or he's the one who becomes the foil for understanding who Jesus is in the world. He verbalizes what everyone holds in their heart. And so he leads out and says, "Well, if it's really you and you're not a ghost, Jesus, let me come to you." And then there's this interesting thing that he takes a few steps out and it all seems great, but then he looks around and he sees the turmoil around him, and all of a sudden he begins to sink down and cries out in help, overcome by the actions of the world around him, the actions of God. He's not one with the Creator as Jesus is. Yet Jesus rescues him, puts him in the boat, and then it says that the disciples worshiped him as the Son of God. They don't worship him as God. They worship him as the Son of God. What does that mean to us today? I mean, we take these stories at times and we go, well, they're just kind of quaint and they're interesting. And sometimes even when we know the historiography about it or try to see what the original writer's intent would be, or what we assume would be the original writer's intent, We kind of come off with a story that says, oh, this is really great new information. I didn't know this before. And then we, kind of pack it away and not do a whole lot with it. It's a hard passage to unpack, to say, what do you do with this? None of us are foolish enough to think that we're just going to go down to the Pacific Ocean and take a trek out to Catalina. None of us consider ourselves so much one with God that we would even attempt to do so. And yet, this passage is supposed to strengthen the church. It's not just a passage that shows that Jesus is above and beyond everybody else. It's not a passage that shows necessarily that the followers of Jesus were stupid or didn't believe or lacked faith. But it was something that was put in this book as a way of strengthening the church. What could that possibly be? It's important to know that the church in all times has had its own challenges in its existence. At times, society seems to be aligned with it pretty well, but at other times we kind of become outliers. We are professing something that is beyond what is normative, a kind of world view that isn't taken up by everybody else in the world. Loving your neighbor has never been a particularly popular point of view as far as nation building is concerned. And what Jesus is doing in this passage is not so much overtly loving one neighbor, although he does take care of Peter and the disciples are reunited with him. It does show that in Jesus there is a unity between God's action and Jesus' action too. That even in the chaos of living, someone can grab onto Jesus and hold tight as a way of seeing what God's action can do in the world, how love can be made evident through the reaching out of a hand and pulling one up. Soren Kierkegaard once said that faith is made most evident in the dark and dreary times of life. This passage occurs in the third watch of the night, probably around 4 a.m. He places it. So it's pitch dark out there in a stormy sea. And where is Jesus but walking on the water? Too often, when storms come into our own lives, we look for help. We look for help that is beyond ourselves. Sometimes we have people who come into our lives and make a difference for us and become a safe passage or a boat that we can hang ourselves into. But we appeal to God in those difficult times as well. We look to God to help answer us out of that turmoil, to pull us out of this sea that we're sinking into, that we find ourselves in, to try to make new start for ourselves. Too often these stories get turned into fairy tales, and we tell them in little children's sermons, and we think of them as quaint, when they're really dealing with the anguish of people who are trying to find faith in hard times. Finding faith in a hard time is a difficult task to begin with, mainly because there are so many things that distract us from our own faith. Peter, the wind and the waves around him, distracted him from a big chance with Jesus. Sometimes we are distracted too by losses in our life, by ambiguities, by things not coming our way, by this COVID that we're living through. And we need to find a safe place to be. We would long to have someone take our hands and pull us up out of the ocean of despair we find ourselves in, and have our feet solid beneath us, be back in the boat as it were, to know that we are safe and are cared for and are loved. This is a loving passage, a passage that says that we are not beyond the reach of God, that there is within all of us the capacity and the potential to reach a hand out and be pulled up from despair, to be made new and to be brought into a safe place. We have that ability within a congregation to do that for one another, but we do point to something that is beyond our control. We do point ultimately in spiritual life to one who sustains us, who's not like the rest of us, one who is a part of the whole of creation, because God created the whole world, the whole universe, and endowed it with the spirit of love that we attempt to tap into, especially in hard times. May you find you being pulled up out of despair May you lean on the God who created this world and sustains us with Jesus as the Son. May you physically be bridged into the boat. We have been given a great gift, that God reaches out and pulls us up, that Christ came to show us this reality, that God doesn't leave us in despair or sinking in, even in the turmoil and the ambiguity of the sea. Grace is ours. Faith is hard to find at night, but a hand is reaching out for you.